"Sir, may I take the leftovers?" The soft voice trembled with a mix of desperation and shame. Marcus Wellington's fingers froze mid-swipe on his phone. The email from Tokyo, the acquisition numbers he'd been waiting for all evening, suddenly meant nothing. He looked up slowly, his vision tunneling as the restaurant's ambient noise faded to silence. Those eyes, that face. For 5 excruciating seconds, Marcus Wellington, CEO of Wellington Industries and 47th richest man in America according to Forbes, couldn't breathe. The young Asian-American woman standing before his table was a ghost, had to be a ghost, because the resemblance was impossible. The same heart-shaped face, the same determined set of the jaw, even when asking for something that clearly cost her every ounce of pride. "Sir?" she repeated, her gaze dropping to the barely touched plates of beef bourguignon, roasted vegetables and artisanal bread that represented more food than she would see in 3 days. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but if you're finished." The restaurant, Le Bernardin, glittered around them with crystal and silver, the murmur of wealthy patrons discussing vacation homes and stock options, creating a backdrop to this impossible moment. Marcus had spent $1,240 on this business dinner, not including the tip. His guest, the CFO of a Japanese tech company he was acquiring, had departed 20 minutes ago. "Who are you?" Marcus finally managed, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't control. The young woman took a half step back, clearly regretting her approach. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have bothered you. I'm Sarah. I actually work here, but not tonight. I just—" She glanced at the food again, hunger battling dignity in her expression. "Never mind, please enjoy your evening." "Wait." Marcus raised his hand, surprised to see it trembling. "Please, sit down." Sarah hesitated, looking around nervously. "Sir, I don't think that's appropriate. I just thought since you were finished, I insist." Something in his tone, perhaps the raw need beneath the command, made her pause. "Please, I'll order more food, whatever you want." Her eyes widened, reflecting suspicion mixed with desperate hunger. "That's very kind, but I'm not propositioning you," Marcus clarified quickly, suddenly understanding how his invitation must seem to a young woman approached by a man 30 years her senior. "I just—" How could he explain that she was the mirror image of his dead daughter, that seeing her had cracked open a vault of grief he'd kept sealed with work and whiskey for 5 years? "You remind me of someone I lost." The simple honesty of this statement seemed to reach her. Sarah slowly pulled out the chair across from him, perching on its edge as if prepared for quick escape. "Jean-Paul," Marcus called to the hovering maître d', who had been watching the exchange with poorly concealed disapproval. "Please bring fresh silverware and another glass, and—" He looked at Sarah. "What would you like? Anything at all?" "I couldn't possibly— Please." The word came out more forcefully than he intended, almost desperate. Sarah swallowed hard. "Perhaps the coq au vin?" She named the least expensive main course on the menu, though it still cost more than she made in 8 hours of work. "Excellent choice. And bring the chocolate soufflé for dessert." "Two." Marcus turned back to Sarah as the maître d' departed with a stiff nod. "I'm Marcus Wellington." "I know who you are, Mr. Wellington," Sarah replied quietly. "Your company was a case study in my economics course last semester." "You're a student?" "Medicine, Columbia, 2nd year." She arranged her napkin carefully on her lap, her movements precise and economical. "I work here 3 nights a week, though not usually in the dining room. I'm usually washing dishes." Marcus studied her face, cataloguing the similarities and differences between this stranger and Emma. The resemblance was primarily in structure, the high cheekbones, the determined chin, the way her eyes crinkled slightly at the corners. Emma's hair had been auburn, not black, her eyes blue, not brown, but something in the spirit that animated those features was hauntingly familiar. "Why medicine?" he asked, forcing himself to stop staring. "I want to be a pediatrician, to work with children who don't have access to quality health care." A small smile touched her lips. "My grandmother always said doctors were like angels. When I was 10, one saved my brother's life after an asthma attack." Emma had wanted to be a photographer. "Travel the world, capturing beauty in unexpected places," she'd said. Marcus had dismissed it as impractical, insisted she consider business or law instead. Their last argument had been about her application to art school instead of Harvard. "Your grandmother sounds wise," Marcus said, his throat tight. "She is. She raised me and my brother after my parents died." Sarah's hands twisted the napkin slightly, the only sign of her discomfort. "Car accident. I was 16. The parallels were becoming eerie. Emma had died in a car accident at 17. Marcus had been in Singapore closing a deal while his wife and daughter drove home from a college visit in the pouring rain. A truck had crossed the median. Neither had survived. Jean-Paul returned with fresh silverware and a steaming plate of coq au vin. Sarah's composure broke momentarily as the aroma reached her, her eyes closing briefly in appreciation. "Thank you," she whispered, though it wasn't clear if she was addressing Marcus, Jean-Paul, or some higher power. "Please, eat while it's hot," Marcus encouraged, pushing the bread basket toward her as well. Sarah didn't need to be told twice. Though she maintained perfect manners, the careful precision with which she ate spoke of someone accustomed to making food last, to savoring every bite because the next meal wasn't guaranteed. As she ate, Marcus found himself talking about Wellington Industries' latest acquisition, about the market fluctuations that kept him awake at night, about the board meeting he'd endured that morning. It was strangely liberating to speak to someone who had no stake in his business empire, no agenda to push. Sarah listened attentively between bites, occasionally asking surprisingly insightful questions. When the soufflé arrived, her eyes widened in genuine delight. "I've never had this before," she admitted, digging her spoon into the airy chocolate creation. "Oh my God." The moan of pleasure that escaped her was entirely unself-conscious. Marcus found himself smiling, a real smile that reached his eyes for the first time in years. "Worth waiting for?" "Definitely." Sarah looked up at him, her initial wariness replaced by cautious warmth. "Mr. Wellington, why are you doing this? Surely you have better things to do than feed a random student who accosted you for leftovers." The question hung between them, demanding truth. Marcus considered deflecting, offering some platitude about charity or kindness. But something in those familiar yet not familiar eyes compelled honesty. "You look exactly like my daughter," he said simply. "Emma. She died 5 years ago. Car accident." Sarah's spoon paused halfway to her mouth. "I'm so sorry. Our last conversation was an argument about money." The words spilled out before Marcus could stop them, carrying the weight of 5 years of regret. "She accused me of caring more about the business than family." She was right. The restaurant continued its elegant hum around them, but in the space between them time seemed suspended. Sarah set down her spoon and did something unexpected. She reached across the table and briefly touched Marcus's hand. "I'm not her," she said gently, "but I'm glad if meeting me has brought you some comfort." The simple sincerity of her words broke something open inside Marcus Wellington, something that all his wealth and power had been unable to heal. And in that moment, watching this struggling young woman who embodied everything his daughter might have become, Marcus felt the first stirrings of a purpose beyond accumulation, beyond empire building, a purpose he'd never known he needed until now. Sarah's apartment in Queens was a study in dignified poverty. The 2-bedroom unit she shared with her grandmother and younger brother was meticulously clean, but showed the unmistakable signs of struggle: the carefully mended curtains, the mismatched furniture rescued from sidewalks and thrift stores, the constant scent of tiger balm masking the building's persistent damp smell. As she unlocked the door at nearly midnight, carrying a container of leftover soufflé that Marcus had insisted she take, Sarah found her grandmother still awake, her silhouette small and curved in the armchair by the window. "Nai, you should be sleeping," Sarah chided gently in Mandarin, setting down her precious cargo to help the elderly woman to her feet. "I was waiting for you," Mei Chen replied, her clouded eyes searching for Sarah's face. The diabetes that had claimed much of her vision left her relying increasingly on Sarah's care. "Did you celebrate your scholarship?" Sarah guided her grandmother toward the bedroom they shared, allowing Mei to lean on her arm for support. "I did. Something amazing happened, Nai. I met someone who might help me." "A nice doctor from the school?" Mei asked hopefully. "No, a businessman." Sarah hesitated, uncertain how to explain the surreal evening. "We'll talk in the morning. You need rest." After settling her grandmother in bed, Sarah returned to the kitchen and opened the container, staring at the dessert that cost more than their weekly grocery budget. With careful precision, she divided it into 3 equal portions, one for her brother to find when he returned from his late shift at the delivery service, one for her grandmother's breakfast, and the smallest portion for herself. As she savored the rich chocolate, Sarah tried to make sense of the evening. Marcus Wellington had insisted on driving her home personally, in his chauffeured Bentley, extracting a promise that she would meet him the following day at Columbia's medical campus. "I want to discuss something important," he'd said, his expression unreadable. "Something that could help us both." Sarah had agreed, though caution whispered that nothing came without a price, especially from billionaires with sad eyes and complicated motives. Sleep came fitfully that night, her dreams a confusing montage of elegant restaurants and her parents' accident, of Emma Wellington's face, which she'd looked up on her phone, superimposed over her own. Morning arrived with its usual demands. Sarah helped her grandmother measure her insulin, prepared a simple breakfast, left a note for her brother about a plumbing issue that needed attention, and rushed to catch the subway for her morning anatomy lecture. The Columbia University Medical Center hummed with the organized chaos of future doctors rushing between classes. Sarah slipped into the lecture hall just as the professor began discussing the intricacies of the parasympathetic nervous system. Despite her exhaustion, she took meticulous notes, her handwriting small and precise to conserve paper. During the break, her phone vibrated with a text from an unknown number. Outside the main entrance at noon. Temadijos. Sarah stared at the message, reality and fantasy colliding uncomfortably. Last night could have been dismissed as a dream or a random act of kindness from a grieving father. This text made it something more deliberate. At precisely 12 o'clock, Sarah exited the building to find the same gleaming Bentley parked illegally at the curb, drawing curious stares from passing students. Marcus Wellington stood beside it, looking simultaneously out of place and like he owned everything in sight. Both perceptions were accurate. "You came," he said, relief evident in his voice. "I said I would." Sarah adjusted her backpack, acutely aware of her worn jeans and Columbia sweatshirt, purchased second-hand from another student, compared to his impeccable suit. "There's a cafe across the street. Would you join me for lunch? I promise not to take much of your time." The cafe was actually a high-end bistro that catered to visiting parents and hospital administrators. Sarah had never set foot inside, though she passed it daily. As they were led to a quiet corner table, she noticed other students watching curiously. Marcus Wellington was recognizable enough to attract attention. Once seated, Marcus seemed suddenly uncertain, a stark contrast to the commanding presence he'd projected outside. He studied the menu without seeing it, then set it aside with a sigh. "I've spent the entire morning trying to figure out how to say this without sounding either insane or predatory," he began. "I'm not succeeding." Sarah folded her hands on the table. "Just say it plainly, Mr. Wellington." He nodded, appreciating her directness. "I want to pay for your medical education. All of it, tuition, books, living expenses, and I want to provide for your grandmother's medical care." Sarah's face remained carefully neutral, though her heart hammered against her ribs. "Why?" "Because I can. Because you need it. Because—" He paused, searching for words. "Because helping you feels like something I need to do." "Because I look like your daughter," Sarah stated quietly. Marcus didn't flinch from the truth. "Partly, but also because of who you are, what you're trying to accomplish despite overwhelming obstacles." Sarah studied him, weighing his sincerity against her lifetime of hard-earned caution. "What would you expect in return, Mr. Wellington?" The question hung between them, loaded with implications. Marcus leaned forward, his expression earnest. "Dinner. Once a week. Just conversation. About your studies, your experiences, your goals." He hesitated, vulnerability flashing across his features. "I've spent 5 years drowning myself in work and whiskey, trying to forget what I lost. Last night, talking with you, was the first time I've felt connected to anything real." Sarah absorbed his words, sensing the raw truth beneath them. "You want me to be a substitute for Emma?" "No," Marcus said firmly, though his eyes told a more complicated story. "Emma is gone. Nothing can change that. But meeting you has reminded me that there's more to life than balance sheets and board meetings." He pushed a folder across the table. "Everything's outlined here. Full tuition, a living stipend, health care for your grandmother, an apartment closer to campus for all of you." Sarah stared at the folder without opening it, her mind racing. The partial scholarship she'd been celebrating covered only 70% of her tuition, leaving a shortfall of $3,500 per month she had no way to cover. Without additional funding, she would have to withdraw by the end of the semester. Why not just donate to the university's scholarship fund? Help dozens of students instead of just me? "I already do that," Marcus replied simply. This is different. This is personal. Sarah finally opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Everything was meticulously arranged. Financial details, legal protections, even a clause stating that all benefits would continue regardless of whether she maintained the weekly dinners. "You had lawyers draft this overnight," she observed, impressed despite herself. "I had them draft it at 2 this morning," Marcus corrected with a small smile. "I don't sleep much." A waitress appeared to take their order. Marcus requested a salad he wouldn't eat. Sarah asked for water, her appetite obliterated by the surreal conversation. When they were alone again, Sarah closed the folder. "My grandmother raised me to be suspicious of things that seem too good to be true." "Your grandmother sounds like a wise woman." "She is." Sarah squared her shoulders. "She's also going blind because we can't afford the specialist treatments that might save her vision. My brother works 2 jobs instead of attending college because we can barely afford 1 tuition." Her voice remained steady, but emotion colored the edges. "Every night I study until my eyes blur, knowing that 1 mistake, 1 failed exam could cost me everything we've sacrificed for." Marcus remained silent, allowing her to continue. "Do you know what I was celebrating last night? A partial scholarship that still leaves me $3,500 short each month. I've applied for every loan, every grant. I was going to drop out at the end of this semester." She tapped the folder. "This feels like a miracle or a trap." "It's neither," Marcus said quietly. "Just one human being helping another." Sarah laughed softly, without humor. "Billionaires don't typically help random students they meet in restaurants." "Perhaps they should." Marcus's expression grew distant. "5 years ago, my daughter told me I'd lost my humanity, that I'd forgotten what mattered." She was right. The bistro bustled around them, servers delivering elegant plates to nearby tables, students chatting about exams and rotations. In their corner, time seemed suspended between 2 lives that should never have intersected. "1 dinner per week," Sarah finally said, "and I maintain complete control over my education and career choices." "Of course. And my grandmother's treatments start immediately. I'll have my personal physician see her tomorrow." Sarah extended her hand across the table. "Then we have an agreement, Mr. Wellington." As they shook hands, neither could have predicted how completely this arrangement would transform them both. How 1 desperate question about leftovers would lead to a feast of second chances neither had dared to hope for. 3 months passed with the steady rhythm of new routines. Sarah and her family moved into a spacious 3-bedroom apartment in Washington Heights, close enough to Columbia for Sarah to walk to classes. Her grandmother's diabetes was now managed by a team of specialists at Mount Sinai, with treatments that had stabilized her condition and marginally improved her vision. Her brother Michael had reduced his work hours and enrolled in community college courses, his face losing the perpetual exhaustion that had aged him beyond his 19 years. And every Thursday evening at 7 o'clock, Sarah met Marcus Wellington for dinner. Their meeting places varied. Sometimes upscale restaurants where Marcus was treated like visiting royalty, sometimes humble ethnic eateries Sarah recommended, where the billionaire sat in plastic chairs and ate from paper plates with evident enjoyment. Tonight was the 12th such dinner, at a small Italian restaurant in the West Village, where the chef knew Marcus by name but treated him like any other regular customer. "Professor Gardner asked me to join her research team," Sarah said, twirling linguine around her fork. "They're studying pediatric responses to new asthma medications. It would look impressive on my residency applications." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Will you have time with your course load?" "I've been thinking about that." Sarah set down her fork, meeting his eyes directly. "Now that I don't have to work 3 jobs, I actually have time to pursue these opportunities. It's disorienting." "How so?" "I've operated in survival mode for so long that having options feels almost dangerous." A small smile touched her lips. "Last week I spent an entire afternoon in the library, just reading articles that weren't required reading. It felt like stealing time." Marcus recognized the feeling. After Emma's death, he had thrown himself into work with such intensity that board members had expressed concern about his health. 80-hour weeks had become his norm, every minute scheduled, quantified, productive. The concept of unallocated time had become foreign, frightening, a vacuum where grief could find him. "What about you?" Sarah asked, interrupting his thoughts. "Your assistant mentioned you weren't in the office yesterday. That seems unusual." Marcus looked momentarily surprised. "You spoke with Diane. She called to reschedule tonight's dinner." Said you had a conflict that resolved at the last minute. Sarah studied him curiously. So where were you? Secret merger? Hostile takeover? There was gentle teasing in her voice now, a comfort level that had developed gradually over their weekly meetings. Marcus found himself smiling, something he did with increasing frequency in her presence. I was at the hospital, actually. Sarah's expression immediately shifted to concern. Are you all right? Not as a patient, he clarified. I was touring the pediatric oncology department. They're naming it after Emma. Oh, Sarah's face softened. That's wonderful. She would have been proud. Would she? The question escaped before Marcus could censor it, revealing a vulnerability he rarely displayed. Sarah considered this seriously, as she did all his questions about Emma. Though she had never met his daughter, their conversations had painted a portrait of a passionate, idealistic young woman with complicated feelings toward her privileged upbringing. I think, Sarah said carefully, she would appreciate that you're using your resources to help children who are suffering. That aligns with who she was becoming. The phrase who she was becoming struck Marcus with particular force. Emma had been 17 when she died, still forming, still evolving her adult self, just beginning to emerge from the chrysalis of adolescence. What might she have become? The question haunted him daily. The donation came with conditions, Marcus admitted, pushing his half-eaten pasta aside. I'll be personally involved with the department's operation, visiting patients, reading to them, things I've never done before. Sarah's eyes widened slightly. That's not what I expected, nor what the hospital expected, Marcus said with a dry chuckle. They wanted the money without the meddling billionaire. I insisted. Why? The direct question demanded an honest answer. Marcus had discovered that Sarah had little patience for corporate doublespeak or polite evasions. It was refreshingly exhausting, because writing checks is easy, showing up is hard. He met her gaze steadily. I've spent 5 years hiding in my office, telling myself I was honoring Emma by building a bigger legacy for her to inherit, even after she was gone. It was a lie I told myself to avoid facing what I'd lost. The restaurant hummed around them, couples on dates, friends sharing bottles of wine, waiters navigating between tables with practiced grace. In their corner, a different kind of intimacy had developed, one built not on romance, but on mutual recognition. What changed? Sarah asked softly. You know what changed, Marcus replied, equally soft. You asked for leftovers. Their eyes met in shared understanding of how a seemingly insignificant moment had altered the trajectory of both their lives. Sarah reached across the table and briefly touched his hand, a gesture that had become part of their communication, brief moments of human connection, in conversations that sometimes ventured into painful territory. My grandmother wants to meet you, she said, changing the subject with gentle deliberateness. She says she needs to evaluate the man who's buying her granddaughter's time. Marcus raised an eyebrow. She makes it sound rather transactional. Nai is practical and protective. Sarah smiled fondly. She's also making her famous dumplings on Sunday and insists you join us. I'd be honored, Marcus said, meaning it. Though I should warn you, my Mandarin is limited to negotiating factory contracts in Shanghai. She speaks English better than she pretends to, Sarah confided with a conspiratorial smile, but she'll appreciate the effort. As their dinner concluded, and they stepped into the crisp autumn evening, Marcus found himself reluctant to end their conversation. These Thursday evenings had become an anchor in his week, hours when he wasn't Marcus Wellington, CEO and billionaire, but simply a man sharing a meal with a remarkable young woman who challenged and inspired him. My car can take you home, he offered, as they stood outside the restaurant. Sarah shook her head. I'll take the subway. I have notes to review before tomorrow's exam. She hesitated, then added, Besides, your driver makes me nervous. He's too perfect. Marcus laughed. Howard has been with me for 15 years. I think you're the first person who's found him intimidating rather than the other way around. I'm not intimidated, Sarah corrected with mock indignation. I just feel judged every time I put fingerprints on his immaculate door handles. Their easy banter was interrupted by Marcus's phone buzzing insistently. He glanced at the screen, his expression shifting subtly back to the controlled mask of the corporate titan. Tokyo again. I need to take this. Sarah nodded, understanding. Sunday at 2. Don't bring anything except your appetite. Nai considers store-bought gifts an insult to her hospitality. As she turned to leave, Marcus impulsively called after her. Sarah? She looked back questioningly. "Thank you," he said simply, knowing she would understand the layers beneath those two words. Her smile confirmed that she did. "See you Sunday, Marcus." As she disappeared into the subway entrance, Marcus answered his phone with renewed focus, discussing market fluctuations and acquisition timelines with his Tokyo team. Yet part of his mind remained on the conversation just concluded and the subtle shift it represented. For the first time, Sarah had used his first name instead of Mr. Wellington, and for the first time in years, hearing his name spoken aloud had felt like an affirmation rather than a summons. Back in her apartment, Sarah found her grandmother waiting up despite the late hour. May sat in her favorite chair by the window, her gnarled fingers working deftly on a small embroidery project despite her limited vision. "Did your rich man feed you well tonight?" May asked in Mandarin, her tone deliberately casual. Sarah smiled as she sat on the footstool beside her grandmother's chair. "He's not my rich man, Nai. And yes, the food was excellent. Italian." May made a dismissive sound. "Too many sauces, not enough balance." Her needle continued its steady rhythm, creating delicate patterns she could feel more than see. "This man, you speak of him differently now." "Do I?" Sarah asked, genuinely surprised. "At first, you spoke of him as an obligation, a bargain made." May's clouded eyes found Sarah's face with uncanny accuracy. "Now there is respect in your voice, perhaps even affection." "He's not who I expected him to be," Sarah admitted. "There's a kindness beneath all that wealth and power. A sadness, too." May tied off her thread with practiced precision. "Sunday will be interesting." "Be nice, Nai," Sarah warned gently. "He's still my benefactor." "I am always nice," May replied with dignity, though mischief flickered in her clouded eyes. "But a grandmother must judge the character of those who enter her granddaughter's life. Money cannot buy my approval." As Sarah helped her grandmother to bed, she reflected on how thoroughly Marcus Wellington had entered their lives in just 3 months. From the desperate student willing to ask for leftovers, she had become the bridge between two worlds. Her family's struggle and his privilege, between his grief and his redemption, and somewhere along the way, their weekly dinners had transformed from obligation to something she actively anticipated, something that challenged and fulfilled her in unexpected ways. Sunday would indeed be interesting, the collision of separate worlds that were becoming increasingly, improbably, connected. The Wellington Industries corporate headquarters occupied 32 floors of a gleaming skyscraper in Midtown Manhattan. Marcus's private office took up the southeast corner of the top floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering panoramic views of the city he'd spent decades conquering. It was in this office, surrounded by the trappings of his success, that Marcus found himself distracted on Friday afternoon, his thoughts repeatedly drifting to the upcoming Sunday lunch with Sarah's family. In his 30 years of business, he'd negotiated with presidents and prime ministers without a flutter of anxiety, yet the prospect of meeting Sarah's grandmother left him unaccountably nervous. "Mr. Wellington?" His assistant Diane's voice came through the intercom. "The board members are assembled in the conference room." Marcus checked his watch with a frown. The quarterly board meeting he'd almost forgotten. "I'll be right there." In the mahogany-paneled conference room, 12 men and women in expensive suits sat around a gleaming table, tablets and water glasses arranged with military precision before each of them. Conversations ceased as Marcus entered, their collective attention focusing on him with the intensity that 9-figure investment decisions demanded. "Ladies and gentlemen," Marcus began, sliding effortlessly into his role as the commanding CEO, "thank you for your time today." The meeting proceeded with practiced efficiency, financial reports, market projections, expansion strategies. Marcus guided the discussion with the authority that had made him a legendary figure in business circles, his mind processing complex data and interpersonal dynamics simultaneously, until Richard Hargrove, the longest-serving board member, raised an unexpected concern. "Before we adjourn," Hargrove said, his voice carrying the Boston Brahmin inflections of old money, "there's the matter of your recent activities, Marcus." A subtle tension rippled around the table. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Clarify, Richard. Your hospital involvement, the scholarship program, this hands-on philanthropy." Hargrove chose his words with deliberate care. "Several major shareholders have expressed concern that your focus may be diluted." Marcus felt a familiar anger stirring, the reflexive response of a man unaccustomed to having his decisions questioned. For 30 years, that anger had served him well, intimidating opponents and occasionally even allies. He had weaponized it, wielded it like a scalpel to cut through opposition. But now, surprisingly, he felt something else alongside it, a new perspective that allowed him to see the genuine concern beneath Hargrove's challenge. "I appreciate the feedback," Marcus said, his tone measured. "Let me be clear. Wellington Industries remains my primary professional commitment. The company's performance metrics have improved 8% since last quarter, as today's reports confirm." He stood, moving to the window that showcased the Manhattan skyline, a view he'd once considered the ultimate symbol of his success. "However," he continued, "I've come to believe that my effectiveness as CEO is enhanced, not diminished, by engaging with the community our business serves. The pediatric oncology wing is not just charity, it's an investment in the future medical professionals who will keep our workforce healthy. The scholarship program identifies talent we might otherwise miss." Hargrove seemed prepared for this reasoning. "Noble sentiments, Marcus, but there's talk of more personal involvement as well. A specific student you're mentoring? Someone you've taken a particular interest in?" The implication hung in the air, ugly in its insinuation. Several board members shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. Marcus turned slowly from the window, his expression dangerously calm. "Choose your next words very carefully, Richard." Something in his tone made the older man reconsider whatever he'd planned to say next. Hargrove cleared his throat. "No implication intended, simply concerned about time allocation and public perception." "Then allow me to address both," Marcus replied evenly. "My calendar remains unchanged. I continue to work 70 hours weekly for Wellington Industries. As for public perception, our company's philanthropic efforts have generated more positive press in 3 months than our marketing department achieved in the previous year." He returned to his seat, scanning the faces around the table. "Any further concerns?" The silence answered his question. The meeting adjourned shortly after, board members filing out with murmured goodbyes. Hargrove lingered, approaching Marcus with the confidence of their 30-year acquaintance. "No offense meant, Marcus, but people talk. You've changed recently." He hesitated, then added more quietly, "I knew Emma. She would have approved of this evolution." The mention of his daughter's name, so unexpected in this sterile corporate setting, hit Marcus like a physical blow. Before he could respond, Hargrove had patted his shoulder and departed, leaving Marcus alone in the cavernous conference room. Had he changed? The question followed him through the remainder of his workday, through meetings and conference calls, through the robotic motions of corporate leadership that had defined his existence for 3 decades. By 6 o'clock, the executive floor had emptied of all but the most dedicated employees. Marcus stood at his office window, watching lights flicker on across the darkening city. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. "Nai is already preparing for Sunday. I think she's testing 50 dumpling recipes to find the most impressive one. No pressure." The simple message brought a smile to his face, and with it, a sudden, overwhelming certainty that he didn't want to spend another Friday evening alone in his penthouse with only aged whiskey for company. Without overthinking it, he texted back, "Any chance you're free tonight? There's something I'd like your opinion on." 3 dots appeared, disappeared, then reappeared. "Finally, I'm at the library until 9. After that, yes. I'll pick you up at 9:15, Butler Library entrance." "See you then," came the reply, followed by a dumpling emoji that made him laugh out loud. 4 hours later, Marcus stood in the center of a spacious loft in Soho, watching Sarah's reaction as she slowly turned in a circle, taking in the empty space illuminated by temporary construction lights. "This is enormous," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the unfinished loft. "What is it?" "Currently nothing," Marcus replied, hands in his pockets. "It's a commercial property Wellington Industries acquired last year as part of a larger portfolio. Been sitting empty since." Sarah ran her hand along a rough brick wall. "And you're showing me this because—" Marcus took a deep breath. What had seemed like a brilliant idea in his office now felt presumptuous, even grandiose. But Sarah was looking at him expectantly, her usual direct gaze demanding honesty. "I've been thinking about your volunteer work. How you mentioned the lack of healthcare access in underserved communities." He gestured around the empty space. "This could be a clinic. Free pediatric care for families without insurance. Staffed by medical students earning credit hours. supervised by attending physicians. Sarah's expression transformed from confusion to astonishment. "You want to open a free clinic? Here in Soho?" "Actually, I was thinking you might want to open a clinic." Marcus walked toward the large windows overlooking the street. "As the director, once you've completed your residency, of course." For once, Sarah seemed speechless. She walked the perimeter of the space slowly, her mind clearly racing with possibilities. The location is central, accessible by multiple subway lines. The space could accommodate examination rooms, a small pharmacy, waiting areas. She stopped abruptly, turning to face him. "This is an incredibly generous idea. But why?" The question, direct as always, deserved an equally direct answer. "Because I've spent 30 years accumulating wealth without purpose. Because helping one student, one family, even one hospital wing isn't enough to balance the scales." He met her gaze steadily. "Because you've helped me see what actually matters, and I want to build something that honors that understanding." Sarah studied his face, searching for something beyond his words. Whatever she found seemed to satisfy her. "Have you eaten dinner?" she asked, the abrupt change of subject catching him off guard. "I haven't, actually." "Good. There's a noodle shop around the corner that stays open late. We can talk about this clinic idea properly. All the practical considerations you probably haven't thought about yet." Her tone was gently teasing, but her eyes shone with excitement. The noodle shop was cramped and bustling despite the late hour. They squeezed into a small table in the corner, surrounded by students, night shift workers, and the occasional tourist. Marcus, in his $5,000 suit, received curious glances, but was otherwise unremarkable in the diverse crowd. Over steaming bowls of hand-pulled noodles, Sarah began outlining all the elements a community clinic would need: staffing requirements, equipment, regulatory compliance, outreach strategies. Her knowledge was impressive, her passion infectious. Marcus found himself taking mental notes, already calculating budgets and timelines. "You've thought about this before," he observed during a brief pause in her planning. "It's been my dream since undergrad," Sarah admitted. "To create a place where families like mine could get care without choosing between medicine and rent." She twirled noodles around her chopsticks. "But I always imagined it as something for the distant future, after years of private practice to save enough capital." "Why wait?" Marcus asked simply. Sarah laughed, the sound drawing glances from nearby tables. "Because normal people can't just conjure multi-million-dollar medical facilities out of thin air, Marcus." "I'm beginning to see the advantages of abnormality then," he replied with a smile. Their conversation continued well past midnight, moving from the clinic to Sarah's studies, to Marcus's contentious board meeting, to lighter topics that drew genuine laughter from them both. When they finally left the restaurant, the city had transformed into its late-night incarnation, quieter but somehow more alive, the pretenses of daytime replaced by more authentic energy. "I should get you home," Marcus said, gesturing toward his waiting car. "It's late. Actually, would you mind if we walked for a bit? I'm too wired to sleep now." Sarah's eyes were bright with the lingering excitement of their discussion. They strolled through Soho's cobblestone streets, past darkened boutiques and illuminated restaurant windows, their conversation flowing as naturally as if they'd known each other for years rather than months. Marcus found himself sharing stories about Emma that he hadn't voiced aloud since her death, not the sanitized versions he sometimes offered in interviews, but honest recollections of her stubbornness, her idealism, her occasionally maddening refusal to accept the world as it was. "She sounds remarkable," Sarah said as they paused at an intersection. "Difficult sometimes, but remarkable." She was. Marcus stared at the traffic light, seeing instead his daughter's face. "I've spent 5 years angry at the world for taking her. It never occurred to me to be grateful for the 17 years I had with her." "Grief isn't rational," Sarah replied softly. "After my parents died, I spent 2 years planning exactly what I would say to them when they somehow miraculously returned. I knew they were gone, but part of me couldn't accept it. The light changed, but neither moved." "What changed?" Marcus asked. "Nine helped me see that I could honor them by living the life they would have wanted for me, that my success and happiness would be their legacy." Sarah's expression was contemplative. "I think Emma would be proud of what you're becoming now." "And what am I becoming?" The question emerged more vulnerable than he'd intended. "Someone who uses his power to create something meaningful. Someone who sees beyond balance sheets to the human reality they represent." Sarah smiled up at him. Someone who eats noodles in a crowded shop at midnight instead of dining alone in a penthouse. Their eyes met in a moment of perfect understanding, a recognition of how profoundly they had impacted each other's lives in just a few short months. Something shifted in the space between them, a subtle recalibration of their relationship that neither could have articulated but both clearly felt. The moment was broken by the growl of a garbage truck rounding the corner. They continued walking, eventually circling back toward where Howard waited patiently with the car. As they approached, Sarah suddenly stopped, her expression changing. "I just realized something." "What's that?" "In all our discussions about the clinic, we never talked about the name." Marcus hadn't considered this. "You should choose. It's your vision we're building." Sarah shook her head. "No, it should be the Emma Wellington Memorial Clinic." The words hit Marcus with unexpected force. He had spent years ensuring Emma's name adorned buildings and scholarships, but always as extensions of his own legacy. This felt different, a living tribute to the values she had championed, not just the name she had carried. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice uncharacteristically rough. "Absolutely sure," Sarah replied firmly. "A place of healing and hope, accessible to everyone regardless of their circumstances. From what you've told me about her, I can't think of a better way to honor who she was and who she was becoming." Marcus found himself unable to speak, emotion closing his throat. Sarah seemed to understand, gently touching his arm in that way she had, a brief human connection that somehow conveyed more than words. As Howard drove them back toward Washington Heights, Marcus felt something shifting inside him, as if grief's immovable weight had finally begun to transform into something else. Not smaller, not less significant, but somehow less crushing. A grief that could coexist with purpose, even with moments of joy. When they reached Sarah's apartment building, she turned to him before exiting the car. "Sunday at 2, don't be late. Nine considers tardiness a character flaw beyond redemption." "I wouldn't dream of it," Marcus assured her, grateful for the return to lighter conversation. Sarah hesitated, then added, "Thank you for tonight, for trusting me with your idea, with Emma's memory." As he watched her disappear into her building, Marcus realized that the gratitude ran far deeper than she knew, that in asking for his leftovers that night at Le Bernardin, Sarah Chen had inadvertently offered him something he'd believed forever lost, a future worth investing in, beyond mere accumulation and achievement, a future with meaning. 2 years passed with the swift certainty of time, when purpose guides its flow. 2 years of weekly dinners that evolved from formal appointments into family gatherings. 2 years of Sarah excelling in her studies, while Marcus slowly restructured both his company and his life around values beyond profit margins. 2 years of small Sunday lunches at Mei Chen's table, where the billionaire learned to fold dumplings with clumsy fingers that grew more precise with practice. And now, on a bright May afternoon, Marcus sat in the vast auditorium of Columbia University Medical School, positioned between Mei and Michael Chen, watching as a sea of black-robed graduates filed into their seats. "She worked so hard for this day," Mei murmured, her English clear and precise. Her vision had stabilized with proper treatment, allowing her to see the ceremony with only minimal assistance, sometimes studying until dawn. "I know," Marcus replied, remembering the late-night texts Sarah would send him when wrestling with particularly difficult material, questions about medical ethics, frustrations with hospital bureaucracy, triumphs when diagnosing complex cases correctly. She never took a moment of this opportunity for granted. Michael, now in his junior year at NYU, leaned forward to add, even when she had every right to relax a little. Full scholarship, guaranteed residency at Mount Sinai, clinic space already secured, but Sarah still studied like everything might disappear tomorrow. Marcus understood this mindset all too well, the persistent vigilance of those who have known true precarity, who have seen security vanish overnight. It was a perspective his own daughter had never developed, cushioned as she'd been by wealth and privilege. The thought of Emma no longer carried the crushing pain it once had, transformed through these 2 years into something more complex, a melancholy gratitude for what had been, and thoughtful reflection on what might have been. The ceremony progressed with academic pomp, speeches about healing and service, about the privilege and responsibility of entering the medical profession. Marcus listened with half an ear, his attention focused on scanning the graduates for Sarah's face. When her name was called, Sarah Mei Chen with highest honors, The small group in their section erupted into applause that seemed disproportionately loud for their numbers. Sarah crossed the stage with dignified grace, accepting her diploma with a formal handshake that transformed into a genuine hug from the dean who had witnessed her exceptional journey. As she moved the tassel on her cap from right to left, she glanced toward their section, her smile radiant even from a distance. "That's my granddaughter," May announced proudly to anyone within earshot, dabbing at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. Hours later, after photographs and congratulations from classmates and professors, they gathered for a private celebration dinner at the small Italian restaurant where Sarah and Marcus had shared so many Thursday evenings. The owner had closed the establishment to other customers for the occasion, decorating the space with white roses and silver balloons. Sarah, still in her graduation robe but with the cap removed, sat at the head of the table, her cheeks flushed with excitement and champagne. Around her sat the small but devoted family she had gathered, her grandmother and brother, Marcus, and his assistant Diane, who had become a friend, 2 classmates who had been part of her study group, and 3 professors who had mentored her journey. "A toast," Marcus said, raising his glass. "To Dr. Sarah Chen, who will undoubtedly change the face of pediatric medicine in New York City." "To Dr. Chen," the table echoed, glasses clinking. "And," Marcus continued, his voice growing more serious, "to the Emma Wellington Memorial Clinic, which opens its doors next month under Sarah's directorship." A second round of glasses clinked, though Sarah's remained on the table as she studied Marcus with an inscrutable expression. Throughout dinner she seemed distracted, her usual attentive participation in conversations replaced by a quiet thoughtfulness. As dessert was being served, the chocolate souffle that had become their tradition, Sarah finally stood, claiming everyone's attention. "I have something important to say," she began, her voice steady despite the emotion visible in her eyes. "Something I've been preparing for months." The table quieted, all eyes turning to her. 2 years ago, I approached a stranger in a restaurant and asked for his leftovers. She looked directly at Marcus. It was the most desperate and humiliating moment of my life, but also, as it turned out, the most transformative. Marcus held her gaze, remembering that night with perfect clarity. The shock of seeing Emma's features in a stranger's face, the overwhelming emotion that had cracked open his carefully constructed armor. "Marcus changed my life," Sarah continued. "He provided financial support that allowed me to complete my education, care for my grandmother, and help my brother pursue his own dreams." Her voice grew stronger. "But the greatest gift he gave me wasn't money. It was the opportunity to help him reconnect with his humanity, to witness a powerful man rediscover what truly matters." She turned to address the entire table. "Today isn't just about my graduation. It's about completing a circle that began with a desperate request and a moment of recognition between 2 strangers." From beneath the table, Sarah withdrew a wrapped package, which she placed before Marcus. "This is for you. Something I've been working on between exams and clinical rotations." Marcus unwrapped the package carefully, revealing a leather-bound book. Opening it, he found page after page of photographs, news clippings and handwritten notes, documenting the development of the Emma Wellington Memorial Clinic, from architectural renderings to construction photos to profiles of the doctors who had volunteered to staff it. "The final page is still blank," Sarah explained softly. "It's waiting for the ribbon-cutting ceremony next month." Marcus stared at the book, emotion rendering him momentarily speechless. When he finally looked up, the assembled guests were surprised to see tears in the eyes of a man known throughout the business world for his implacable composure. "I don't deserve this," he said quietly. "That's not for you to decide," Sarah replied with gentle firmness. "Just as it wasn't for me to decide I didn't deserve your help 2 years ago." May, who had been watching the exchange with wise eyes, suddenly spoke up. "In my 78 years, I have learned that life rarely gives us what we deserve, good or bad. It gives us opportunities disguised as random encounters." Her English, usually simplified when speaking to others, flowed with poetic precision. 2 souls who needed each other found their way across impossible distance. This is not coincidence. This is grace. A contemplative silence fell over the table, broken only when the chef emerged from the kitchen with a surprise graduation cake illuminated by sparklers rather than candles. The celebration resumed its festive tone, though something profound had shifted in the atmosphere, a recognition of the journey they had all taken together. As the evening wound down, Sarah and Marcus found themselves alone at the table, the other guests having moved to the small bar area for digestives and coffee. "There's something I've never told you," Sarah said, tracing the rim of her water glass with one finger. "About that night at Le Bernardin." Marcus raised an eyebrow questioningly. "I didn't approach you randomly." She met his gaze directly. "I knew exactly who you were. Your company had been the subject of my economics class case study the previous semester. Your photo had been in the PowerPoint presentation." "You knew I was Marcus Wellington?" Marcus asked, surprised. Sarah nodded. "I knew you were worth billions, that you could have ordered 10 more meals without blinking." Her expression grew distant, remembering. "But I also knew you had lost your daughter in a car accident. That had been mentioned in the professor's notes about your leadership style changing after her death." Marcus felt a chill run through him. "So you approached me because you knew I was wealthy?" "No," Sarah's voice was firm. "I approached you because I saw something in your eyes that matched what I felt inside, a kind of hollow recognition of what life takes from us." She reached across the table to touch his hand briefly. "I didn't expect anything beyond maybe a meal. I certainly never imagined this." She gestured around them, encompassing not just the restaurant, but the larger life they had built together. Marcus absorbed this revelation, turning it over in his mind. "Does it matter that our meeting wasn't entirely chance?" "I think it makes it more meaningful, not less," Sarah replied. "We weren't just two random people colliding in a city of millions. We were two souls recognizing something in each other, a need, a possibility. Like your grandmother said, grace, not coincidence." "Exactly." As they prepared to leave, gathering coats and leftover cake carefully packaged by the attentive staff, Marcus found himself watching Sarah, now Dr. Chen, with a complex emotion he had eventually recognized as paternal pride. Not because she resembled Emma physically, but because she embodied the values he had tried to instill in his own daughter: perseverance, compassion, integrity. "What happens now?" he asked as they stood on the sidewalk outside the restaurant, the spring evening wrapping around them with gentle warmth. "Now I start my residency. You continue revolutionizing corporate America with your radical emphasis on human well-being. We keep having Thursday dinners." Sarah's smile held the confidence of someone who had fought her way to security. "And in 4 weeks, we open a clinic that will help thousands of children who might otherwise fall through the cracks of our healthcare system. And after that?" "After that," Sarah said simply, "we keep building together." The word hung between them, together, encompassing all they had become to each other: mentor and mentee, benefactor and recipient, surrogate father and daughter. Something neither had sought, but both had desperately needed. As they walked toward the waiting car, Marcus reflected on how thoroughly his life had transformed since that night when a desperate young woman had approached his table asking for leftovers. How her question had cracked open the shell he'd built around himself after Emma's death. How her presence in his life had helped him channel grief into purpose, isolation into connection, accumulation into contribution. 2 years ago, he had been a man who had everything by the world's standards yet felt hollowed out by loss. Now he was someone who measured wealth differently, by lives impacted, by relationships nurtured, by purpose fulfilled. Sarah had once asked why he wanted to help her, and he had said it was because she looked like Emma. That had been true but incomplete. What he couldn't articulate then but understood clearly now was that she had offered him something beyond mere resemblance. A chance to become the person he should have been for his own daughter, a chance to align his resources with his values, a chance to rediscover what truly mattered. And in return, what had he given her? Financial security, certainly. Educational opportunity, yes. But perhaps most importantly, the freedom to pursue her innate compassion on a scale that would transform countless lives beyond her own. Their story wasn't about charity or coincidence or even redemption. It was about how sometimes, in a world that can seem cold and transactional, the simple human connection between two people can ripple outward, creating waves of transformation neither could have achieved alone. As they drove through the glittering Manhattan night, Marcus remembered something Emma had said during their last argument. "What's the point of all this success if it doesn't make the world better for anyone but us?" At the time, he had dismissed it as teenage idealism. Now he recognized it as the most profound wisdom she had tried to share with him, wisdom he had only been able to hear through Sarah's echo of that same essential truth. The car passed the construction site where the Emma Wellington Memorial Clinic was nearing completion. Soon it would welcome its first patients, children whose families, like Sarah's once had, struggled at the margins of society, their potential limited by circumstances beyond their control. Children who would now have access to care, regardless of their parents' financial status. Children whose lives would take different trajectories, because two strangers had connected across the divide of privilege and need. And it had all begun with 7 simple words, spoken in desperation and humility. "Sir, may I take the leftovers, please?" Words that had transformed leftovers into a feast of second chances. Words that had reminded a grieving father that his daughter's legacy could live on not just in buildings bearing her name, but in the values she had tried to teach him. Words that had opened the door to healing neither party had believed possible. In this vast, often indifferent city, where millions passed each other daily without truly seeing one another, their story stood as testimony to what becomes possible when we dare to reach across the divisions of circumstance and status, when we recognize that beneath our different exteriors, we share the same fundamental needs for purpose, connection, and the chance to make our lives matter. And perhaps most importantly, their journey reminded anyone fortunate enough to witness it, that our most desperate moments, the times when pride must bow to necessity, when we are most vulnerable and exposed, can become unexpected doorways to our greatest transformations. That sometimes, the very thing we think will break us instead becomes the first step toward making us whole.